Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. During World War II, most Americans were focused on the land war in Europe, and perhaps it was due to their familial connections with England and the European continent, and our Europe First strategy. Therefore, the military leaders with whom we are most familiar with were those who were prosecuting the land war and were necessarily Army officers. The more unique among them became more newsworthy. Generals Douglas MacArthur, George C. Marshall, George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery, and even Erwin Rommel on the enemy side. Several of these men continued in the limelight in the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War. Eisenhower, of course, became president, and Marshall served as Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. Yet the admirals who led the war in the Pacific were not household names and did not have the notoriety of the aforementioned Army generals. Admirals Ernest J. King and William Leahy were somewhat familiar to Americans due to their close association with President Roosevelt, but they were primarily seen and not heard in photographs and movies. Ian Toll, the naval historian and author of the Pacific War trilogy, opined there is another and deep-seated reason for the disparity between the public personas of the Army and Navy leaders, which has its roots in the Spanish-American War. Rear Admirals William T. Sampson and Winfield Scott Shelley became embroiled in a controversy over who won the Battle of Santiago. The dispute spilled over into the public domain, and the press, particularly the Hearst newspapers, which made the brouhaha front-page news. It was sufficiently embarrassing to the Navy that President Theodore Roosevelt entered into the fray. The senior admirals in the Pacific in World War II were midshipmen or junior officers during this period, and it had a long-term effect on how they presented themselves to the public. In essence, you did not wash the Navy's dirty linen in public, you did not embarrass the Navy, and you did not engage in self-aggrandizement. My interest in the Navy began as a small boy where I lived near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where many famous ships were built, including the battleship Missouri. New York was a Navy town with a huge presence, including a naval air station not far from my home. One morning during the war, my father took me out to Gravesend Bay to watch the battle-scarred carrier Franklin limp into port for repairs. The ship was listing to starboard as she solemnly passed through the Narrows, with her ensign at half-staff, and the extent of the damage was overwhelming. So I began to read periodicals and books about the Navy and eventually focused on the naval leadership in World War II. Professor E.B. Potter's biography of Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz sparked a lifelong quest to learn more about his life. I am a plank owner in the National Museum of the Pacific, located in the expanded site of the old Nimitz Hotel in Fredericksburg, Texas. The museum's quarterly Nimitz Dispatch provides enriching material about the Admiral and the war in the Pacific. Other than the Battle of Midway, my remarks today cover only part of the greater story of our initial fight for survival in the Pacific, as I will dwell primarily on Nimitz the man and his family, and less on the great naval battles and the island-hopping strategy that culminated in victory over the mighty forces of Imperial Japan. My aim is to provide the essence of this man, where he came from, his upbringing, and what led to his selection as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, over more senior admirals at a time of great peril and when the outcome of the war was by no means determined. The early life of Chester Nimitz was typical American story of that era. He was born in Fredericksburg, Texas on February 24, 1885, the son of the recently widowed Anna Nimitz. Due to the proximity of his birthday with St. Valentine's Day, Anna called her son "My Little Valentine." His grandfather, Charles Heinrich Nimitz, a Saxon German, emigrated to the U.S. at age 14, and after serving in the Merchant Marine, joined with other German immigrants and founded the town of Fredericksburg, and eventually built the Nimitz Hotel there. Charles Heinrich was extremely fond of Anna and was so touched by the orphan state of his grandson, he moved them into his hotel and became devoted to little Chester. Nimitz grew up like all children of his generation in Fredericksburg and was bilingual in an atmosphere that was at least German as it was American. Anna later married her late husband's younger brother, Willie, and the family moved to Kerrville, Texas, where Willie managed the St. Charles Hotel. Later on, Chester worked at the hotel, initially in menial jobs, and eventually worked his way up to hotel desk clerk. Newly minted West Point graduates on their way to postings to forts and outposts in the West stayed at the hotel, which was located at major crossroads. These well-mannered young men, resplendent in their cavalry uniforms, conversed with young Nimitz, much to his delight. Chester became enthralled with their air of worldly sophistication, and he eventually sought an appointment to the military academy. The local congressman informed Nimitz that all the appointments were filled, but he did have one appointment to the Naval Academy, which was not known to Nimitz. There were many qualified candidates, and the congressman had to conduct an examination to select the principal appointee. A devoted school teacher tutored Chester in English literature and the language arts, and his stepfather, who was the only college graduate in the family, helped him with math and science subjects. Nimitz studied diligently before and after working at the hotel and received the highest grades on the exam, which resulted in his appointment to the Naval Academy. The congressman was so impressed by Nimitz, he accompanied the young man on the train trip from Texas to Annapolis. Another offspring of German immigrants by the name of Dwight Eisenhower wanted to attend the Naval Academy, and no appointments were available, so he opted for West Point, and the rest is history. My first full assignment as an admiral was in Stuttgart, Germany, where I made the acquaintance of a delightful German history professor. During one of our discussions, he remarked that it was not lost on his countrymen in World War II that the U.S. military leader in Europe and his naval counterpart in the Pacific were both grandsons of German immigrants. Nimitz graduated from the Naval Academy in 1915, and his first sea duty assignment was aboard the battleship Ohio, which arrived in Far Eastern waters at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, when Admiral Togo defeated the Russian fleet at Tsushima. Nimitz was in a group of junior officers who were assigned to attend a victory party in honor of Admiral Togo on the grounds of the Imperial Palace. Fortified with Russian champagne, captured by the Japanese, Nimitz approached the admiral and invited him to his table. Admiral Togo graciously accepted and engaged them in a brief conversation. Nimitz never saw the admiral again, but because of the deep impression he had of him, became involved in honoring the memory of this great naval leader. In a stroke of irony, the arrival of the cruiser Augusta under the command of now Captain Nimitz, made a port visit to Tokyo in June 1934, which coincided with the death of Admiral Togo. Nimitz attended the service ashore and the funeral rites in Togo's home as well. 11 years later, and immediately following the surrender ceremony aboard the battleship Missouri, Admiral Nimitz went ashore with the express purpose of visiting Admiral Togo Memorial Gardens and the flagship Mikasa. He was instrumental in raising funds to restore the Mikasa and Admiral Togo's home, which was heavily damaged during the firebombing of Tokyo. The Japanese never forgot his generosity, and he received visitors from Japan until the end of his life. On May 8th, 1976, the 130th anniversary of the founding of Fredericksburg, the Japanese government gifted the Museum of the Pacific with the Japanese Garden of Peace. The garden was designed as a replica of Admiral Togo's private garden. Nimitz's progress through the ranks was not without controversy. As an ensign, he received an early command of an old destroyer, the Decatur, and while entering Batangas Harbor in the Philippines, he went aground on a sandbar. There is a facetious saying in the Navy, a collision at sea or a grounding will ruin your entire day. And it was certainly a black day for Nimitz. He was court-martialed, but the court considered his flawless record and relative seniority and convicted him on a lesser charge for which he received a public reprimand. Except for the embarrassment, the court-martial did no harm to his career. In 1909, he was assigned to submarines, which was not popular duty. He was disappointed, and he was reputed to have said, "In those days, submarines were a cross between a Jules Verne fantasy and a humpback whale." Nimitz, in typical fashion, put aside the disappointment and focused on the tasks at hand. Following his command of 3 submarines, he successfully lobbied for removal of gasoline engines from submarines due to their toxicity and their explosiveness, and had them replaced with diesels. He became a recognized authority on diesel engines, and in 1913, the Navy sent him to Hamburg to study the German diesel techniques. At that time, Germany was the world leader in diesel engine technology. Earlier that year, Nimitz married Catherine Freeman, a native of Wollaston, Massachusetts, and she joined him on his temporary assignment in Germany. Nimitz's career had some odd detours, not of his making, but he progressed nevertheless by applying himself to the fullest where and whenever the Navy sent him. As a commander, he attended the Naval War College when the esteemed Admiral William S. Sims, a noted iconoclast, was president of the college. Sims was an early proponent of the aircraft carrier, ultimately replacing the battleship as the Navy's capital ship. In the course of study, Japan was always the enemy in the war games, and Nimitz later wrote to the current president, quote, "The courses were so thorough that after the start of World War II, nothing happened in the Pacific was strange or unexpected. I credit the Naval War College for my success in strategy and tactics, both in peace and war," end quote. In 1926, the Navy established the first NROTC units at UC Berkeley, Northwestern, University of Washington, Harvard, Yale, and Georgia Tech. Commander Nimitz was ordered to stand up the unit at Cal Berkeley and became the school's first professor of naval science. He was considered an outsider and initially was not well received by the faculty. But over time, and through the very force of his character and work ethic, he overcame their resentment and had a lasting respect for the university. While there, Nimitz was promoted to captain. Next came command of a destroyer squadron in San Diego, followed by command of the cruiser Augusta in the Asiatic Fleet. Nimitz believed in giving every man as much responsibility as he could handle, and he had an abiding rule that he should never do anything his juniors could do, least of all mere ship handling. This reminds me of my own experience as a lieutenant aboard a cruiser and asking the captain if I could maneuver the ship alongside the pier, and he responded, "Yes, when you make captain." Obviously, he was not a Nimitz-trained man. In 1935, he received orders to Washington, D.C. as Assistant Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, and 3 years later, he was selected for Rear Admiral. Command of Battleship Division I followed, and then back to Washington as Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Navy bureaucracy, the Bureau of Navigation was responsible for all aspects of naval personnel: recruiting, manning of ships, inshore installations, promotions, etc. And later on was more appropriately renamed the Bureau of Naval Personnel. Sunday evening, December 7th, 1941, Nimitz was working around the clock, as were all high-ranking officials in Washington, and his daughter Catherine had taken over her father's chore of walking Freckles, the family Cocker Spaniel. She walked the dog off leash because of his good behavior. When they turned on the Massachusetts Avenue, they came upon an astonishing sight. On the lawn of the Japanese embassy, a fire was blazing, and employees were burning boxes of official papers. The press and photographers were everywhere, even in the trees, while crowds looked on. Suddenly, to Catherine's horror, Freckles dashed onto the lawn in full view of the reporters, the public, and the police, and defecated in plain sight. Red-faced, Catherine grabbed the dog and ran home. She said to her mother, "There's all the press up there, and if they only knew, they could write a headline: Admiral's dog hurls defiance at Nippon." 10 days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was in his apartment at 2222 Q Street in Washington, D.C., when he received a telephone call from the White House and heard the patrician voice that all Americans were familiar with from the radio fireside chats and in the movie-tone newsreels in the local theaters. "Nimitz, this is Franklin Roosevelt, and I am calling to personally inform you that I have selected you to relieve Admiral Husband Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, in the rank of Admiral. And I want you to get out to Pearl Harbor as soon as possible, and stay the hell out there until we win the war." Nimitz later revealed, "I completely understood those orders." Unlike many other admirals, Nimitz did not have a personal relationship with FDR. The president, who had been the Undersecretary of the Navy, considered himself a former naval person in the style of Winston Churchill, and he knew most of the senior naval leadership by name and had sailed on many of the Navy's capital ships. Admiral and Mrs. Nimitz attended the formal Navy birthday ball in October 1941, barely a month prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz's table was across the room from the president's, and he was not introduced to FDR by the naval leadership, nor in typical Nimitz fashion did he give any thought to making his presence known to the president. The following day, he and Mrs. Nimitz began packing his bags, his appropriate uniforms for Hawaii, when he was called to a meeting with Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and the Chief of Naval Personnel, Admiral Harold Stark, at Maine Navy on Constitution Avenue. This meeting was followed by a whole series of day and night discussions and planning sessions, climaxed by a conference at the White House. A major topic of discussion was what should be done with the weakened U.S. forces in the Pacific. There was not much good to report, and it was depressing to say the least. On Thursday morning, the President announced that a 5-man board headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts would investigate the failure of U.S. defenses. The announcement included the relief of Admiral Kimmel, the replacement of Lieutenant General Walter Short as head of the Hawaiian Department, and replaced Major General Frederick Martin as commander of the Hawaiian Air Forces. Vice Admiral William Pye would be acting CINCPAC Fleet until Nimitz assumed command. The decision was made for security reasons that Nimitz would travel in civilian clothes under the assumed name Freeman, his wife's maiden name, until he safely arrived at his final destination. His flag secretary, Lieutenant Lamar, acted as a bodyguard and traveled with Nimitz to San Diego. The initial plan was to fly Nimitz to the West Coast and then to Hawaii. Nimitz protested. He was extremely tired following a bout of bronchitis and wanted to travel by train in order to rest and regain his strength and use the time to review briefing material. Secretary Knox and Admiral Stark acquiesced, and Mr. Freeman and Lieutenant Lamar traveled to Union Station by taxi and boarded the B&O train to Chicago in adjoining rooms with a door between. They did not encounter anyone they knew. A brief stop after in Chicago, Nimitz and Lamar departed on the Santa Fe's Super Chief for San Diego. After lunch, Lamar entered Nimitz's compartment with the large canvas satchel the Chief of Naval Operations entrusted to him and handed Nimitz the contents. The instructions were not to let it out of his possession and not to show the Admiral the contents until they were well along the way outside of Chicago. The complete report of the material and human casualties at Pearl Harbor, with grim photographs of sunk and damaged ships, was shocking to Nimitz, and it also confirmed his growing conviction that Secretary Knox was wrong in blaming Admiral Kimmel and the commanders in Hawaii. Nimitz was convinced no one could have known. To relieve the monotony of the long ride across the plains, Lamar and Mr. Freeman got off the train during the infrequent stops and trolled about the platform. On one occasion, as Nimitz proceeded to leave the train, he stepped into the WC. The porter's routine was to lock the toilets before the train came to a stop. When Nimitz was ready to emerge, he was locked in. The train pulled out of the station, and the porter forgot to unlock the door. Nimitz was unable to unfasten the lock from the inside and pushed and pulled the door handle to no avail. In desperation, he began pounding on the door and calling out in a loud voice. Now, here's a man who has designed and installed naval machinery and had a reputation as an authority on diesel engines, was defeated by the locked door. 15 minutes later, the porter heard the bang and unlocked the door. He looked scornfully at what he thought was a bungling, middle-aged civilian. "Now look," he said, "if you're inside, you get out by moving this latch." Nimitz responded, "Oh, you think so? Well, you give me your key and get inside and try it." Nimitz locked the door and returned to his compartment, and was perverse enough to enjoy sitting comfortably, enjoying the situation for exactly 15 minutes. He then went back and opened the door with the key and released the impounded porter, now exasperated with fruitless banging and yelling. The encounter left the admiral in a merry mood. Nimitz had a well-developed sense of humor and loved to tell corny jokes. When he was a newly promoted captain, his wife Catherine smilingly rebuked him and said his jokes were beneath his new rank. The admiral arrived in San Diego on December 22nd and remained overnight. The following morning, he boarded a Catalina flying boat, and while taxiing, the wind caught the wing of the plane and plunged the engines underwater. The flight was aborted, and a new aircraft was ready the next day, Christmas Eve, and they departed without incident. Nimitz, ever the people person, apologized to the crew for taking them away from their families on the holiday. The aircraft did not head directly to Oahu. Instead, they headed to Molokai. As the plane circled for a landing, Nimitz looked down at East Lock, the main anchorage, covered in black oil. The battleships Oklahoma and the target ship Utah were bottoms up. A mine lader was on her side. The heavily damaged Nevada was aground. The battleships California, West Virginia, and Arizona were sunk, with only their topsides visible. Upon landing, a whaleboat came alongside, covered with oil, and the trip ashore was miserable. Vice Admiral Pye, the acting fleet commander, led the reception committee and escorted Nimitz to a set of quarters on Makalapa. The following morning, Admiral Kimmel joined Nimitz for breakfast, and in a generous act of subordination, was wearing 2 stars instead of the 4 he wore as Cinque Fleet. He appeared stooped and worn out, and revealed that on the morning of the Japanese attack, a spent .50 caliber bullet broke through his window and struck him in the chest. "Too bad it didn't kill me," Kimmel said quietly. Nimitz warmly pressed his hand and told him he had his sympathy. And the same thing could have happened to anyone. Nimitz reflected. There was such a spirit of despair, dejection, and defeat, you would have thought the Japanese had already won the war. On Christmas Day, 1941, Nimitz was given a boat tour of the destruction. The young helmsman asked, "Well, Admiral, what do you think of all this destruction?" Nimitz responded, "The Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could ever make, or God was taking care of America. Mistake number 1 was the Japanese attacked on a Sunday morning, when 9 out of every 10 crewmen of those ships were ashore on leave. A normal workday, the casualties would have been exponentially higher. Mistake number 2 occurred when the Japanese saw all these battleships lined in a row. They got so carried away sinking those ships, they never once bombed our dry docks opposite those ships. If they had destroyed the dry docks, we would have had to tow every one of those ships to the mainland to be repaired. The ships were in shallow water and could be raised and pulled over to the dry docks, repaired and at sea, and in the time it would have taken to tow them to the mainland. Mistake number 3, 5 million gallons of fuel oil on top of the ground in storage tanks are 5 miles away over that hill. One attack plane could have strafed those tanks and destroyed our fuel supply, and the fleet would have been forced back to the West Coast. Construction of the underground fuel storage tanks had begun the year before, and our fuel supplies were no longer susceptible to air attack. The Japanese failed to attack the submarine base, so no submarines and supporting equipment were damaged. Thus, submarines could proceed to the Western Pacific and start their long campaign of destroying the Japanese merchant marine. Nimitz was disappointed to learn the Navy and the Army authorities in Hawaii did not receive intelligence of a possible attack by the Japanese. They were not informed of the talks between the U.S. and Japan in Washington had collapsed. General Short and Martin told him they were informed that the primary threat was from indigenous Japanese and sleeper cells on Oahu, which turned out ultimately untrue. Lack of sufficient personnel due to budgetary constraints dictated the decision to group aircraft together and create perimeter defense using a small security force. Unfortunately, this made targeting easier for the Japanese and resulted in the destruction of most of the aircraft. My research revealed that in June of 1941, the Peruvian ambassador to Japan informed the American ambassador of a recent incident at a diplomatic social event. A Japanese admiral who had a bit too much to drink said, if a war came between the U.S. and Japan, it will begin with an attack on Pearl Harbor. Our ambassador reported the incident to the State Department, where it apparently died. However, Nimitz believed the lack of a specific warning for the Navy had a bright side, because if Admiral Kimmel had been alerted to the attack on Pearl Harbor, he would have followed normal Navy procedures and put out to sea and met the enemy striking force of 6 carriers, and his whole fleet would most certainly have been sunk, and we would have lost 38,000 men instead of 3,800. Nimitz also learned that a mobile radio station was established on Thanksgiving 1941 at Opana, located 532 feet above sea level, with an unobstructed view of the Pacific. The site was manned by 2 radar technicians, Army Air Force privates, who detected an extremely large number of aircraft approaching at 7:02 on December 7th. The men reported their findings to the Information Center at Fort Shafter, where a lieutenant told them it was nothing. The Opanasites were so concerned they contacted Fort Shafter again, and the lieutenant again responded it was nothing, assuming the activity was a flight of Army B-17 Flying Fortresses expected that day, and advised the crew not to worry. The radar site was another victim of budget cuts and operated intermittently to save on expenditures for spare parts. The Roberts Committee continued its investigation amid continuing bad news. The atmosphere of defeat surrounded him, and Nimitz concluded morale at Pearl Harbor was sinking rapidly. He decided he could wait no longer to assume command, so at 10:00 on the morning of December 31st, on the deck of the submarine Grayling, Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet. There were those who believed Nimitz was influenced to assume command aboard a submarine because he was a submariner, but the fact was that no other deck was available in Pearl Harbor in the aftermath. Later that day, Nimitz called a conference with the combined staffs, and it could only be described as a gloomy assemblage. He told them that he had complete and unlimited confidence in every one of them, and that he did not blame them for what had happened at Pearl Harbor. If there were any that wanted reassignment, he would listen to them, but insisted that certain key individuals must remain in place. Those key individuals included Commander Edward Layton and Lieutenant Commander Joe Rochefort, Kimmel's intelligence officers. There was a sign of relief in the room as Nimitz's brief comments were not what they were expecting. His actions that day are an example of what Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, educator, and prolific author, espoused in his writings that leadership isn't some sort of manipulation. Real leadership depends on integrity, and it has extraordinary power. It alone can make the difference between success and failure in anything you do. Drucker liked to relate the story of the great football coach Vince Lombardi, who took over the Green Bay Packers when even its very existence was uncertain. Its record the previous year was 1 win, 1 tie, and 10 losses. It was the worst in its history. In Lombardi's first year as head coach, the Packers had 7 wins, and Lombardi was named Coach of the Year. The following year, Green Bay won the NFL Regional Championship and barely missed winning the overall NFL title. The third year, Lombardi's Packers won the NFL Championship. These same players were the losers before Lombardi came aboard. An incident occurred in Nimitz's senior year at the Naval Academy which played a role in his character development and how he approached subordinates who made mistakes or ran afoul of rules and regulations. As his class approached graduation, they were allowed to go into town in civilian clothes to have their officer uniforms made by local tailors. Nimitz brought a suitcase with him, and on the way back, he filled it with beer purchased at a local store. While engaged in the transaction, he noticed a nicely dressed gentleman standing nearby observing him. He passed through the academy gates with the booty without problem, and that evening hosted a successful beer party for his classmates in the rafters of an unfinished part of the newly constructed Bancroft Hall. The following day, Nimitz was surprised to find an instructor in a new class who was the aforementioned gentleman, but now in uniform. They looked at each other, but not a word was uttered. Some of those who know the story are of the opinion that the instructor did not recognize Nimitz as the young man who purchased the beer. But Nimitz was convinced otherwise. Had Nimitz cashiered his intelligence team, the outcome of the Battle of Midway might well have been different. Lieutenant Commander Joe Rochefort was instrumental in decoding most of the Japanese communications that pointed to their planning to invade the strategically critical island of Midway. However, in early 1942, when the U.S. began detecting signs of an impending attack, the target was encoded AF. Locations in the Japanese code book, such as AF, were not definitively known by the U.S. So Rochefort's team developed a ruse and sent orders to Midway by underwater cable to broadcast a message that the island's desalination plant had broken down. Midway sent the message without encryption to ensure the Japanese could read it, and then waited to see if they would take the bait. They did, and transmitted an encoded message stating that AF's desalination plant was out of order. Nimitz's intelligence team thus confirmed that AF was Midway. Rochefort then put together an intelligence profile that concluded the attack would come in late May to early June 1942. The intelligence team convinced Nimitz that Admiral Yamamoto, confident that he had the advantages in numbers and quality, wanted to destroy the American carrier fleet. He planned to confuse the U.S. with a diversionary attack on the Aleutians by drawing us north and launching his main attack on Midway Island, causing us to move south into an ambush. As the Japanese fleet was widely dispersed, Yamamoto was forced to transmit his strategy by radio, allowing Layton and Rochefort to recover most of the plan. The Battle of Midway was an epic clash between the U.S. Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy, which took place 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. There was a massive imbalance between the two fleets, and it was not possible to win a direct engagement. And Nimitz had to stake everything on exploiting our intelligence windfall. He knew where the Japanese carrier forces were and when they would most likely attack, and thus was able to position the 3 American aircraft carriers to ambush the Japanese. Our tactical commanders, Rear Admirals Frank Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, had only one task: to find and destroy the Japanese carriers. We knew the first attack would be decisive for either side, as carriers were full of fuel and ordnance, hence highly vulnerable to bombs and torpedoes. Once the forces had been located, Spruance began the attack by launching a full strike from the Enterprise and the Hornet. We lost 47 of 51 torpedo bombers during the initial attack and failed to damage or destroy any of the 4 Japanese carriers. Fortuitously, 2 squadrons of Navy dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers Akagai and Soryu and seriously damaged them such that all 3 had to be abandoned. The carrier's defensive fighters had been distracted by their earlier attacks on our torpedo bombers. Only the carrier Hiryu escaped, but would be caught and destroyed by American dive bombers 6 hours later. It was an incredible victory, but it was also something for which the U.S. Navy's carrier aviators had planned and trained. Once Admiral Yamamoto learned of the disaster that had struck his carriers, he was still hundreds of miles to the west with the main battle group and reversed course. Spruance, a late replacement for Admiral Halsey, who was ashore recovering from a serious bout of shingles, would become the hero of the battle. The 2 admirals presented a contrast in styles. Spruance tended to be quiet and meticulous, while Halsey was brash and more impetuous. U.S. Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morrison characterized Spruance's performance as superb and said that he emerged from the battle one of the greatest admirals in American naval history. Shortly after the Midway battle, Spruance became Chief of Staff to Admiral Nimitz, and in September 42 was appointed as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. In August of 43, Spruance was placed in command of the Central Pacific Force, which was later redesignated the 5th Fleet. At the end of the war, Nimitz chose Spruance as his successor. Yet because of his modest, retiring nature, Spruance was never a popular hero in the manner of Bull Halsey. He disliked personal publicity and had a reputation for freezing reporters who invaded his privacy. The severe losses in Japanese carriers at Midway affected the balance of naval air power during the remainder of 1942 and was crucial in neutralizing Japanese offensive threats in the South Pacific. In 1943, Midway became a forward submarine base, greatly enhancing U.S. capabilities against Japanese shipping. The U.S. Navy's decisive and successful defense of the major base on Midway ended Japanese hopes of neutralizing the United States as a naval power, and the U.S. gained the initiative and effectively turned the tide of World War II in the Pacific. While the tide of war had turned in our favor, the battle in the Pacific was by no means over. Admiral Nimitz would be promoted to the rank of Fleet Admiral, along with Admirals King, Leahy, and Halsey. The war would continue for 3 more long years of hard fighting, with terrible loss of life in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Savo Island, the Marshalls, Palau, Tarawa, Tinian, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. World War II in the Pacific finally came to an end when the Emperor announced the unconditional surrender of Imperial Japan on 15 August. Subsequently, Admiral Nimitz had the honor of signing the instrument of surrender for the U.S. aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of December, 1945. Nimitz would return to Washington as the Chief of Naval Operations and was not happy with the post-war atmosphere of budgetary and reductions and constraints, the fight to maintain naval aviation, and the Marine Corps as a separate entity. He was successful in advocating for nuclear submarines and support for a little-known Navy captain by the name of Hyman Rickover. But on the whole, he was not happy with how the Navy had changed. The tour of duty for the C&O was changed from 4 to 2 years, and Nimitz retired on December 12, 1947. The following day, the Admiral, Catherine, and Nancy got in their 12-year-old Chrysler and headed for the West Coast. They purchased Longview, the home of their dreams, at 728 Santa Barbara Road in Berkeley, California, for $32,500 and began their new life. Nimitz found time to indulge in gardening and his writing hobby, but avoided writing about World War II operations, lest in giving credit to one officer or force, he might imply that another was less deserving. He believed there was enough glory for all, and that the distribution of credit or blame should be left to historians. In typical Nimitz fashion, he wrote an article for the American Federalist. "Labor, we thank you. A salute to workers who during the war kept the armed forces provided with ships and munitions." Nimitz refused to write an autobiography or permit his biography to be written during his lifetime because, quote, he was likely to be too emotionally involved to present an objective view of himself, and his prejudices might hurt the people he served with, end quote. He had regular correspondence with Professor Potter, who upon the Admiral's death, the family chose to write the magnificent biography Nimitz, published in 1975. In 1963, Longview became a burden, with Catherine suffering severe arthritis and Nimitz's declining health following a fall. The Navy offered Nimitz the recently vacated Quarters 1 on Yerba Buena Island, the grand old residence built in 1898 for the first Navy Admiral in San Francisco, and had an elevator. And since they were public quarters, Nimitz was entitled to a staff commensurate with his rank. On Sunday, February 20th, 1966, and after several stays at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, including back surgery to reduce the pain from an earlier injury, Nimitz died while Catherine held his hand. His body lay in state for a short time at the Treasure Island Naval Station, and then the casket was taken in a motorcade of about 100 vehicles to the Golden Gate Cemetery. The casket was then placed on a caisson drawn by 12 sailors, followed by a riderless horse with a naval officer's sword. The Protestant graveside service was read by the Chief of Naval Chaplains. Nimitz's old friend, Francis Cardinal Spellman, offered a prayer, and the Secretary of the Navy, Paul Nimitz, presented the national colors and the Admiral's personal flag to Catherine. When a friend offered condolences to Catherine, she replied, "I'm not feeling sad. To me, he has just gone to sea. As I have done so many times in the past, someday I will follow him." Nimitz is buried on a hill surrounded by his closest wartime friends, Admiral Raymond Spruance, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, and Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and their wives. In January 1989, I assumed command of the combat logistics ships in the Pacific Fleet, with headquarters in San Francisco, and was assigned to Quarters 1 on Yerba Buena Island. The quarters had been renamed Nimitz House in honor of the late Fleet Admiral, who lived there until his death 55 years ago today. Living in this historic edifice encouraged me in my quest to learn more about this great American. I used the opportunity to interview people on the island who knew Nimitz and hosted a dinner party for Sister Mary Aquinas, the Admiral's youngest daughter, who was a Dominican nun and head of the biology department at Dominican University. I would be happy to share some of these stories with you during the Q&A following my talk. Thank you.